Welcome again to our series, Questions and Answers for a World in Crisis. And today, the subject is consecration. From Sri Aurobindo, from the Synthesis of Yoga. All yoga is, in its nature, a new birth. It is a birth out of the ordinary, the mentalized, material life of man, into a higher spiritual consciousness and a greater and diviner being. No yoga can be successfully undertaken and followed unless there is a strong awakening to the necessity of that larger spiritual existence. The soul that is called to this deep and vast inward change may arrive in different ways to the initial departure. It may come to it by its own natural development, which has been leading it unconsciously towards the awakening. It may reach it through the influence of a religion or the attraction of a philosophy. It may approach it by a slow illumination, or leap to it by a sudden touch or shock. It may be pushed or led to it by the pressure of outward circumstances or by an inward necessity, by a single word that breaks the seals of the mind, or by long reflection, by the distant example of one who has trod the path, or by contact and daily influence. According to the nature and the circumstances, the call will come. But in whatever way it comes, there must be a decision of the mind and the will, and, as its result, a complete and effective self-consecration. The acceptance of a new spiritual idea force and upward orientation in the being, an illumination, a turning or conversion seized on by the will and the heart's aspiration. This is the momentous act which contains, as in a seed, all the results that the yoga has to give. The mere idea or intellectual seeking of something higher beyond, however strongly grasped by the mind's interest, is ineffective unless it is seized on by the heart as the one thing desirable, and by the will as the one thing to be done. For truth of the Spirit has not to be merely thought, but to be lived. And to live it demands a unified, single-mindedness of the being. So great a change as is contemplated by the yoga, is not to be affected by a divided will, or by a small portion of the energy, or by a hesitating mind. He who seeks the divine must consecrate himself to God, and to God only. If the change comes suddenly and decisively by an overpowering influence, there is no further essential or lasting difficulty. The choice follows upon the thought, or is simultaneous with it, and the self-consecration follows upon the choice. The feet are already set upon the path, even if they seem at first to wander uncertainly, and even though the path itself may be only obscurely seen, and the knowledge of the goal may be imperfect. The secret teacher, the inner guide, is already at work, though he may not yet manifest himself, or may not yet appear in the person of his human representative. Whatever difficulties and hesitations may ensue, they cannot eventually prevail against the power of the experience that has turned the current of the life. The call, once decisive, stands. The thing that has been born cannot eventually be stifled, even if the force of circumstances prevents a regular pursuit or a full practical self-consecration from the first. Still, the mind has taken its bent and persists, and returns with an ever-increasing effect upon its leading preoccupation. There is an ineluctable persistence of the inner being, and against it, circumstances are in the end powerless, and no weakness in the nature can for long be an obstacle. But this is not always the manner of the commencement. The sadhaka is often led gradually, and there is a long space between the first turning of the mind and the full ascent of the nature to the thing towards which it turns. There may at first be only a vivid intellectual interest, a forcible attraction towards the idea, and some imperfect form of practice. Or perhaps there is an effort not favored by the whole nature, a decision or a turn imposed by an intellectual influence, or dictated by personal affection and admiration for someone who is himself consecrated and devoted to the highest. In such cases, a long period of preparation may be necessary before there comes the irrevocable consecration. And in some instances, it may not come. There may be some advance. There may be a strong effort, even much purification, and many experiences other than those that are central or supreme. But the life will either be spent in preparation or a certain stage having been reached, the mind pushed by an insufficient driving force may rest content at the limit of the effort possible to it. It is nothing less that is meant in the end when we speak of the absolute consecration of the individual to the divine. But this total fullness of consecration can only come by a constant progression when the long and difficult process of transforming desire out of existence is completed in an ungrudging measure. Perfect self-consecration implies perfect self-surrender. In the first movement of self-preparation, the period of personal effort, the method we have to use is this concentration of the whole being on the divine that it seeks, and as its corollary, this constant rejection, throwing out, catharsis of all that is not the true truth of the divine. An entire consecration of all that we are, think, feel, and do will be the result of this persistence. This consecration, in its turn, must culminate in an integral self-giving to the highest, for its crown and sign of completion is the whole nature's all-comprehending absolute surrender. Sri Aurobindo writes so much more in the Synthesis of Yoga that we recommend reading it in full. Namaste.